Good afternoon. Those of you that have joined us here in our Forum on Racial Equality and Justice here in Southeastern California Conference. It's been a drizzly Sabbath afternoon in our territory, and we're grateful that you have chosen to join us. As we have continued in our commitment in our conference territory towards racial equality and justice, we wanted to have another meeting here in January as we're starting a new year. And today is really about learning together and educating each other. And Robert's going to be talking, Elder Robert Edwards, about the purpose of today. And then Jonathan Park, our executive secretary, will offer our opening prayer. And then we'll introduce our wonderful presenter today, who's was a colleague of mine as the conference president. And I'm so grateful that Elder Dana Edmonds has joined us today, and we'll be introducing him shortly. So Robert, talk to us about the purpose of today's presentation as we continue to learn together in this commitment we have towards racial equality and justice in Southeastern California Conference.
Elder Edwards, we want to thank you for that.
Sorry, we're having audio problem, and we will move Elder Robert Edwards to after we pray together. So why don't we bow our heads? Father God, we thank you for loving us. We thank you for giving us opportunity to come together to talk about your world, our world, your desire. Father, we know that you have vision of our world, a world that's full of love, equality, justice, all the things that you desire, Father. Yet, that is not reality here in this world. Having said that, Father, we believe that through your Spirit, we could join together to walk hand in hand, pursuing equality and justice, where a world where the weak are protected, people will not go hungry or poor, a world where peace is built with justice, justice is guided by love. So, Father, through this time together, inspire us, give us courage that we need, that through your power, your kingdom will be established here on this earth. I ask that you be with our speaker as he shares the history, his conviction that you have given to him. Help us to be informed and be able to discern your will and live. We thank you for loving us, Father. In Jesus' name, amen.
It seems that we still can't hear Elder Edwards. I apologize for that. We're having difficulty with his audio. But we had asked him to talk about the purpose of today. And like I mentioned, we are wanting to continue to educate each other and ourselves. We have often, I think, sometimes felt like racism is not a part of the fabric of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Today, will learn more about how indeed that is not true, that there are systemic issues, there are systemic things in our history that we still need to work on. And we still need to do work here in Southeastern California Conference. Our speaker today, I was hoping that, again, Elder Edwards would be able to introduce him, but he's a colleague of mine that I have grown to appreciate through the years. Just a wonderful, kind-hearted leader, and always, as a conference president, was gracious to me and grew to appreciate him very much. He is now the executive director of the Office of Regional Affairs for the North America Division. And that is a leadership position that is extremely important as we as a division continue to look at how we as an entire church in North America can continue to work together towards the goals of racial equality and justice. So I appreciate today him being with us, taking the time, and Elder Edmonds, thank you as a colleague and as a friend for investing in Southeastern California Conference's conversation today. And I'm going to turn it now over to Marquise Johns. Pastor Marquise is in our conference as evangelist for Black ministries and also directs our community service and prison ministries and several other ministries in our conference territory. He's going to be our moderator today. And at the end of Elder Edmonds' presentation, you will have a few moments to ask some questions, and Marquise will guide you through that. We will finish by 5 o'clock. So thank you so much, Marquise, for moderating today's conversation. We appreciate your ministry, your leadership, and take it from here.
Thank you so much, Sandy. I first want to applaud my president, Sandy, as well as our entire executive team for tackling such a want to say controversial subject, but given that we don't exist in the regional context, to be able to have this conversation shows vision, shows leadership, and we appreciate you for that. As early as 1907, Lewis Sheaf, and some years later, a gentleman by the name of John Mann decided to take their entire churches out of the Adventist system and set them on their own. This served as a precursor to what we now call the regional conferences. And today we have someone who is not only informed, but very passionate about the regional system, about the regional structure, and how it came into existence. So in our attempt to better equip and better understand our denomination and some of the issues that have plagued it, particularly that as it concerns racial inequities, as well as we have to be honest about even gender inequities. We have invited Pastor Dana Edmonds to give us the history, to bring us up to speed on the origin of the regional conferences in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we're hoping that you have a lot of questions. Please put those in the chat menu, whether you're watching on Facebook or whether you're watching on YouTube. And we'll circle back and ask him some of those questions once he has completed his presentation. Nonetheless, we're excited for this opportunity to learn about the origin of the regional system. Elder Edmonds, the floor is yours.
Elder Johns, thank you, Dr. Roberts and Elder Edwards for this invitation. We want to go, I want to make it clear at the outset that we are simply sharing history. We're not attempting to advocate anything, but we're simply telling you the history of regional conferences and what and why they work for those of us who have them. Right here, you see a picture of a historic meeting in Nairobi, Kenya, with the African leadership and the leadership of the regional conferences. Your vice president for the Pacific Union Regional Ministries, Virgil Childs, he's in there somewhere. We have over the last couple of years forged a working relationship with the almost 45% of Seventh-day Adventists who reside on the continent of Africa. when you combined the 45% of Adventists who are African with our brethren in the Caribbean who are of African descent and people in North America who are of African descent, you will discover that the largest single demographic by far are people in the Seventh-day Adventist Church are people of African descent. That is also true, although by not quite as large a percentage. The largest single demographic in the North American division are people of African descent. So I just wanted to show you that. That's just a part of what that's what we do when we have we show that, and we use that to kind of talk about what my office does. But that's not the purpose of this meeting today. So we're going to skip through the rest of those pictures. Here we have Emmett Till. Most of you have heard of Emmett Till. That's Emmett Till on your left. He was a teenage young man who was born in Chicago, came to spend the summer with relatives in North Mississippi, was accused, probably falsely, of relating inappropriately to a Caucasian female. And so that's also Emmett Till on the right. That's what happened to him. He was brutally beaten and killed. And the reason why I show that picture is to give you an understanding of the context that African Americans operated in both the United States and in the Seventh-day Adventist Church at the time regional conferences got started. I am a very proud Seventh-day Adventist. My grandmother heard this message and accepted this message when she heard Edson White on the Morning Star in Vicksburg, Mississippi. My family has been Seventh-day Adventist for over 100 years. When I was a teenager growing up in Cleveland, Ohio, I had no non-Adventist relatives on either side of my family. So I am Adventist through and through and very proud of it. I'm also a proud citizen of the United States. I've lived off the mainland for a few years, and I can tell you, having lived off the mainland and having had the privilege of traveling to 4 continents, I believe that the United States is the greatest country on earth. Having said that, the harsh truth is both the Adventist Church, which is the church of the living God, the church of Bible prophecy. I believe that with all my heart. But the Adventist Church and the United States both share a common characteristic, and that is an ugly history with racism. I wish that weren't true, but it is true. And so that's the background for what we're about to share, the context that Black Americans had to operate both inside the church and outside the church in the United States. Let's define what a regional conference is. Most people, when they hear the word regional conferences, they think of a conference that is Black. And technically, that's not true. It is true that regional conferences are African American administrated, but they contain many different nationalities. For example, one of our second largest regional conference in terms of tithe is Allegheny East. They have approximately 15 different nationalities represented in their churches. And they have all kinds of employees, including Caucasian employees. That's also true of where I used to work in South Central Conference. I had the honor of hiring the first Caucasians, the first female pastor, the first female administrator, the first Korean pastor, expanded the Latino Ministries Department. And so regional conferences are not Black conferences, they're Black administered. What regional conferences are all of the churches in a region coming together and forming a conference, as opposed to all of the conferences in a state coming together and forming a conference. So In the Adventist Church in North America, there are two kinds of conferences: regional conferences, all the Adventist churches in a region, and state conferences, all the conferences in a state, or even in the state of California, which is a very large state, obviously, multiple conferences coming together in one state. Here's an example. The Lake Region Conference, it was the very first regional conference founded in 1944. So it's about a little over 75 years old. It is made up of churches in Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Now, inside Lake Region are 5 state conferences: the Michigan Conference, the Illinois Conference, the Indiana Conference, the Wisconsin Conference, and the Minnesota Conference, right? And that's important for us to realize, because I shouldn't say very often, but from time to time, the question comes, why do we have 2 separate organizations carrying out the same work? So in Nashville, for example, where I live, you have the South Central Conference, where I used to serve as president, and you have the Kentucky-Tennessee Conference. The irony of that is both Kentucky-Tennessee Conference and and South Central have their headquarters in the Nashville area. Dr. Roberts knows Steve Haley, the president of the Kentucky-Ten Conference. He is my good friend. He and I became presidents 10 days apart. He remains the president, and we remain friends. He called me about 2 weeks ago just to chat. So a natural question is, okay, why do you have 2 organizations carrying out the same work? And we in the regional conferences are asked, aren't regional conferences a duplication of services? That is to say, Kentucky 10 has an office in Nashville. Why do you need an office in Nashville? Well, let's look at let's answer that question. Let's look at these organizations. And I use South Central because that's where I got started. But let's go back to the first regional conference, which is Lake Region. Okay, so remember we told you that inside Lake Region, which is made up of Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Inside of Lake Region, there are 5 state conferences, okay? 1 regional conference, 5 state conferences, same territory. Each of those 5 state conferences has their own conference office. Each of them has their own set of administrative officers, a president, a vice president, a treasurer. Each of them has their own set of departmental directors, youth director, education director, publishing director, et cetera, et cetera. Each of them has their own campground, and each of them has their own Adventist book center. So I want you to understand the picture. On the one hand, you have Lake Region, which has one of all those 5 things. And then on the other hand, you have 5 state conferences, which has 5 of those things. In other words, Lake Region, there's 1 president for Lake Region, but there's 5 state conference presidents. There's one conference one set of conference officers in Lake Region. In those 5 state conferences, there's 5 state conferences. There's 1 set of departmental directors for Lake Region. There's 5 set of state conference departmental directors. There's 1 campground in Lake Region. There's 5 campgrounds in the state conference. There's 1 Adventist book center in Lake Region. In the same territory, there's 5 Adventist book centers. Okay, so let's ask ourselves, ladies and gentlemen, who's duplicating services? Is it the entity that has one of everything, or is it the 5 entities that have one of everything? Which is the more efficient business model? The entity that has one, or the 5 entities that have 5? Which is less expensive to operate? The entity that has 5 or the entity that has 1? Inside the territory of the 9 regional conferences, there exist 30 state conferences. So while it is often said that regional conferences are duplication of services, the reality is you could make a better argument for state conferences being duplication of services. Now, that isn't to say that we need to get rid of state conferences at all. It's simply to say that over the years, regional conferences are the only conferences that have been forced to justify their existence. Part of the challenge that regional conferences operate is we operate in a context where state conferences are seen as the norm and regional conferences are seen as the aberration. And so we are forced to constantly justify our existence. All right, let's talk about 3 pivotal figures in regional conference history. Now, I'm going to stop for a second. I want to make sure I'm not talking to myself. Elder Johns, you can still hear me. Is that right? Uh-oh. Did I lose everybody?
No, let me in. No, you're doing a fantastic job,
Okay.
Elder. We're all backstage cheering you on. Keep going, keep going, keep
okay.
going.
I didn't hear anything, so I said, "Oh, did technology fail me again?" Okay.
No, you're doing fantastic.
Okay. Now my heart is no longer in my throat. Okay. Okay. We want to talk about 3 pivotal figures in regional conference history. Here's the first, Charles M. Kinney.
Yes.
I call him the George Washington of regional conferences. And the reason why I call him that is he is the first African American in the Adventist Church to be ordained. Okay. And you all in California actually had a hand in that because the church was organized very differently in those days. He was actually hired by Stephen Haskell, who is the president of what was called then the California Conference. And to show you how different the Adventist Church was in those days, he was the president of California, but he assigned Elder Kinney to work in the Midwest. And so he was sent to Missouri and sent to Kansas City and wound up in St. Louis. Well, in St. Louis, the Lord blessed him because he was a very good worker. The Lord blessed him and allowed him to bring a number of people of African descent, because that's who he was sent to work for. He was successful by the grace of God in bringing a number of people into the remnant church. Okay, that sounds good. But while there was joy, keep in mind that at the point that Elder McKinney brought these people, these African Americans, into the church, there were no African American churches. So he brought these African Americans into a Caucasian church. And while there was joy in heaven, there was no joy in St. Louis. Even Ellen White remarked about one of the sad things that happened in the church was the way those African Americans were treated when they became Seventh-day Adventists. The inconvenient truth is we have had a very hard time in the Adventist church maintaining a Caucasian presence, generally speaking, when the African American presence gets over a certain number, right? So white flight is not just a problem in society, it's also a problem in our church, right? So George Kinney was one of the first ones that said, maybe African Americans, they weren't called that then, but maybe colored people, which is what we were called then, would be better off with their own entities, right? Here's the next pivotal figure in Black Seventh-day Adventist history, Charles Barnett. Now, Charles Barnett has a unique distinction of being a pivotal figure in Adventist African American history without being a Seventh-day Adventist. Charles Barnett was a newspaper columnist, right? And the thing that we know about African American journalists in the 30s and the 40s, they did not write for papers like the Los Angeles Times or the San Francisco Chronicle. You could, if you were a Black journalist, you had to write for a Black newspaper. I'm old enough to remember as a little boy, the Cleveland Call and Post. That was the Black newspaper. And one of the things, and let me stop just for a second to recall a day in American history when Black people were not able to lead anything that was not overwhelmingly Black. In other words, if you're my age, you grew up in a context where no leaders beyond the church were Black. There were no Black mayors. There were no Black governors. There was one Black senator when I was growing up. But there were no Black mayors. There were no Black governors. There were no Black there in the Adventist church. There were no Black union presidents. There were no Black division presidents. Even in Africa, the work was led by white Americans and white Europeans. So imagine growing up and not seeing anybody leading anything other than the church who looked like you. And that's why, without attempting to be partisan, that's why on this past Wednesday, when I was sitting where I'm sitting now, and looking at the inauguration and seeing the swearing in of the former senator from your state, now the Vice President Kamala Harris, I got choked up because when I was growing up, I did not even imagining seeing a Black vice president, much less a Black female vice president. So Charles Barnett was a gifted journalist, but in order to be a journalist, he had to write for Black newspapers. And so he had Black Adventist friends who told him what it was like to be a Black Seventh-day Adventist in the 30s and 40s. Let me give you a couple examples. If you were a Black Seventh-day Adventist and you went to visit the General Conference headquarters and it was lunchtime, guess who was not eating in the General Conference cafeteria? Anybody Black. I went to Andrews after I graduated from Oakland. I went to the seminary. But Andrews, which was called Emmanuel Missionary College in those days, though they admitted Blacks, they did it in a segregated fashion. You could eat in the cafeteria at Andrews, but you had to eat at the colored table. housing was segregated. Um, uh, housing was segregated. The cafeteria was segregated, and that's the way it was in the Adventist church. I am old enough to remember days when there were certain Adventist schools, Black people, Seventh-day Adventist schools that Black people could not get into. All right, and Charles Barnett wrote about that and embarrassed the church, right, by making public the way Black people were treated in the Adventist church. But then came the straw that broke the camel's back. Lucy Bayard. Lucy Bayard lived in New York, and she fell ill with a form of cancer. She wanted to be treated in an Adventist church, Adventist hospital. The Adventist hospital system is humongous. We operate, I think it's the second largest Protestant hospital system in the world. In the state of Florida, which is one of our largest states, the Adventist healthcare system, it used to be called Florida Hospital. They changed the name, so I forget what it's called now. I used to sit on their board, it was amazing to see that was the one place in Adventist church that had a few nickels. When I was on their board, it was an $8 billion industry. The Adventist healthcare system in Florida is the largest employer in the state of Florida. If you're a basketball fan like I am, and you saw the playoffs in the bubble, some of the playoff games were held at Advent Arena. That's the arena whose naming rights belong to Advent Health. That's the Adventist healthcare system. But anyway, even then, the Adventist hospital system was big. So she wanted to be treated in an Adventist hospital. Well, in those days, you wrote in advance, and that's how you were admitted. So I think she and her husband came on a train. It may have been a bus, but anyway, they came up from New York, came to what was called Washington Sanitarium, right? That was the Adventist hospital in Washington, but there was a problem. Both the state of Maryland and Washington Sanitarium forbade the admission, the general admission of Black people. Now, there were some Black people who were able to get, but they were not allowed to be treated as regular patients. Okay, so generally speaking, both the state of Maryland and Washington, get this now, Washington Sanitarium did not admit Black Seventh-day Adventists. Well, how did Sister Bayard get admitted? Well, if you look at her, she's very fair-skinned. So as we used to say back in the day, she passed for white. But you had to fill out the application, and she told the truth and said that she was colored. And as soon as they found out that she was not white, after having admitted her, they unadmitted her, stuck her in the hallway where legend says she died. Now, she really didn't die in a hospital. She did die 3 weeks later. But what they did was they sent her to what was called Freedman's Hospital in Washington. Well, in one of the great ironies of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and I had a meeting with the leadership of what was then called Florida Hospital, and they were horrified to know that they had done that. And this was what formed the impetus for regional conferences, this incident. But one of the great ironies is Freedman's Hospital in Washington, which was a Black hospital that they sent Lucy Byard, is now Howard University Hospital, which is now run by the Seventh-day Adventist healthcare system. I don't know what they call it in that area, but that's an Adventist hospital now. It's actually the CEO is a young lady who I knew very, very casually when I was growing up in Allegheny West. I'm from Cleveland. She's from Pittsburgh, and so that hospital that they sent her to is now, she was sent from an Adventist hospital to what is now an Adventist hospital. All right, that enraged the people in Washington, and because the Lord knows what He's doing, there was a large church, a large African American church in Washington called Washington First Church. It had, for its day, an unusually large number of educated and professional Black people. Now, if you go to Washington now, that's you have tons of professionals. In fact, probably the single largest block of tithe and regional conferences comes out of the Washington, D.C. area. Okay, so but in those days, there were in the 40s, there were of course far fewer Black Adventist professionals than there are now, but there was a disproportionate number of them in Washington First Church. For example, if you went to Oakwood, you know Eva B. Dykes. The library is named after Eva B. Dykes. Eva B. Dykes was the first African-American female, period. Not the first African-American Adventist female, but the first African-American female, period, to finish the requirements for a PhD. She went to that church. The second Adventist, second Black female to finish the requirements for a PhD went to that church as well. Though she never said anything to me when I was growing up, my church school principal, I discovered in reading, went to that church. And so they were enraged by what happened to Lucy Byard. Their enragement, which is a word I just made up, their enragement was exacerbated by the General Conference vice president. In those days, there was no North American division. So there was a vice president there was a General Conference vice president for North America. And so he went to preach at that church right after Lucy Byard got kicked out of the White Hospital. And he tried to smooth over things by, and let me say parenthetically, one of the challenges of racism is we've moved to a time, and I'm thankful that we moved to a time where racism is denounced. Except for the white supremacists on the fringes, and at least people pay lip service. And there are a lot of people who do more than that. But everybody at minimum at least pays lip service to racism. Where the rubber meets the road is when it comes from denouncing it to actually doing something about it. So the vice president went there to say, oh, this is terrible, but he really wasn't prepared to do anything about it. And so he used as his text, beloved, think it not strange with the concerning the fiery trial, which is to try you, which was interpreted by the blacks in that church was, okay, y'all just need to kind of suck it up. And they were enraged. In fact, they didn't even let him out the door before the church service ended. One of the people stood up and said, I think it's strange that I can't get into certain institutions. I think it's strange. He just went on and on, read the riot act. But the good thing about these people is they, as disgusted and as offended as they were, they decided that they were not going to leave the church. They were going to try to change the church. And one of the things that can be said about African Americans is African Americans have in overwhelming numbers been loyal and have loved both a country and a church that did not love them, has not loved them back. Okay. You do not hear you don't hear Black people talking about let's leave the Adventist church because of racism. Black people, generally speaking, love the Adventist church even when it has not loved them. So they didn't leave the church. They formed a group that was called the Committee for the Advancement of Worldwide Work Among Colored Seventh-day Adventists, or in other words, the Black Adventist version of the NAACP. And they said, okay, we're done with discrimination in education. I told you, most of our schools, I shouldn't say most of them, but a large number of our schools either had policies that wouldn't let Black people in, would only let Black people in limited numbers, and then segregated them when they got there and kind of mistreated them. I'm not going to name the school that I went to because I don't want to embarrass it. But my oldest sister, some of you know Nancy Dudley, she's an outstanding musician. That's my oldest sister. She went to the school that I started to call out. I'm glad I didn't. She went to the school that I went to. In fact, all four of us graduated from there. She was there when Dr. Martin Luther King got assassinated. That school was 97% Caucasian Adventists. When it was announced that Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, the students applauded. Okay. That's the context that we had to operate. It is alleged, and this school was in the north. This is not some school in the deep south. This school was up north, and this school was alleged to have only opened its doors to Black people a few years before I got there, because it had been ordered to by the state Supreme Court. Now that was alleged. I haven't been able to dig in to find out whether that was true or not. But Black people, it is true that Black people were horribly treated and segregated in education. So they said, listen, we've had enough of discrimination in education. Then this group said we had enough of discrimination in administration. It took the Seventh-day Adventist Church 100 years to have the first Black vice president of the General Conference. 100 years. There were for years and years and years, there were no Black people in leadership. Even the General Conference Negro Department was founded to, just like you have a women's ministries, a youth department. Once upon a time, you had a Negro department. But the first three directors of the Negro department were not Negroes. They were Caucasians. Just like the first presidents of Oakwood were not Black. They were Caucasians, because it was felt for a long time that Black people were not capable of running anything in the church and beyond. Remember, I told you, I grew up in a time where there were no Black leaders, even in sports. There were no Black head coaches. There were no Black quarterbacks. There were no Black middle linebackers, because middle linebackers were the quarterbacks of the defense. There were no Black centers in football, because centers set the protections. I'm getting into sports jargon, but you had to be real smart to be so anything that called for leadership and intelligence, we were denied the opportunity to do. I was in seminary, and they were still sending Caucasians. I was in the seminary when they sent the president of the New Jersey Conference to be one of the division presidents in Africa. Because it was assumed that Black people were not capable of leading. Okay, I already told you about and by the way, in 1962, that happened at General Conference. That only happened because, once again, the church was embarrassed. There was a Black journalist named Miles Martin. Now, this time he actually he actually wrote for a white paper. Miles Martin lived in Cleveland. My parents were friends with him. He passed away maybe 2 years ago, but he wrote, and he wrote just before the General Conference opened about the discrimination in education, and embarrassed the church to do something that they had not done before, and they gave F.L. Peterson. If you from Oakwood, Peterson Hall is named after F.L. Peterson, Dr. Rock, who's out west with you all now. His first wife was F.L. Peterson's daughter. She was Clara Peterson, and of course she passed away a few years ago. But he was the first Black administrator. So all that led to shortly after Lucy Byard died, and shortly after the formation of the Adventist version of the NAACP, which petitioned the General Conference to change what they did, at the spring meeting of the General Conference, April 8th through 11, the General Conference, those of you who work for the church, and some of you don't know, the General Conference meets, the executive committee meets twice a year, the spring council and the fall council. And Pacific Union has been the subject of some of their conversation at some of those meetings. They met and formed, they met and voted to allow unions to establish regional conferences. That's not what they called them in those days. They called them colored conferences. And they put in their stipulation that is important. And that was they voted that they be operated by colored pastors and colored executive committees. And I said that was important because up to then, Black people were very rarely allowed to run anything. I don't know if there are any Black administrators in the church besides the ones in the colored department or the Negro department then, and at Oakwood. The second thing that's important to note is that was a vote of the General Conference. Black people did not say, we are mad, we're going to break off and form our own conferences. That was a vote of the General Conference. So there are those who try to delegitimize regional conferences, but regional conferences are a vote, came about as a vote of the General Conference, which in all candor had a choice at that point between full integration, which is what some Black people were pushing for, full integration or regional conferences. I need everybody to understand that the church, given a choice between full integration and regional conferences, chose regional conferences. And that's how they came to be. The first one was in the Lake region. About 3 weeks later, they formed Northeastern, which is now the largest regional conference and is the 4th or 5th largest conference in North America. And then shortly after that, they formed what was called then the Allegheny Conference. Allegheny got split up in 1967 between Allegheny East and Allegheny West. And Allegheny East is the second largest regional conference. It's one of the 10. Northeastern is probably fifth in tithe, and Allegheny East, even after it's splitting up, is like ninth in among all the conferences in North America. All right, and then I'm not going to take time to tell you about all the other regional conferences. Okay, so here's where I want to end. Some people say, Elder Evan, okay, that was then. Why do you all still have regional conferences? Well, let me show you something. I'll answer your question. Okay, in 1950, there were approximately 250,000 members in the North American division. 21,000 of them were in regional conferences. So that meant state conferences had about 230,000 people. Regional conferences had about 20,000. Today, the North American division is about 1.25 now, probably 1.3 now million, and 320,000. We'll get the latest figures at our board meeting, which starts Monday. So I would guess that number is probably closer to about 330-ish, something like that. Okay, so. What that tells us, ladies and gentlemen, is over the last 75 years. Let me go back. Over the last 75 years, state conferences have grown from about, the membership in state conferences is a little over 900,000, give or take. So that means they've grown from about 230,000 to about 900,000. So that means they've multiplied about 4 times, which is good. If you have a business and that business has multiplied 4 times, you're happy with that. But regional conferences started out at 20,000 and now have 320,000, which means regional conferences have multiplied 16 times. Regional conferences are one of the great success stories in the Seventh-day Adventist Church over the past 75 years. If all the regional conferences said, we're going to form a union, there would be 9 regional conferences, and that would be one more conference than I think Pacific Union. I think there are 8 conferences in Pacific Union. But if regional conferences form their own union, they would be, in terms of conferences, about the size of the average union in terms of conferences, number of conferences. But if regional conferences form their own union, they would be the largest union in tithe and membership in the North American division. Okay, let me say that again. If regional conferences were a union, they would be the largest union in terms of membership and tithe in the North American division. Right now, that honor goes to Southern Union. For a long time, it was Pacific Union, but Southern Union overtook Pacific Union, and now Pacific Union is second. But Southern Union is the largest in part because it has 3 large regional conferences in it. South Atlantic, Southeastern, and South Central. Okay, those 3 conferences together have about 140,000 members. And so they are a big reason why Southern Union is the largest union in terms of tithe and membership. And they're the largest union in terms of tithe in the world, right? But if you took those 3 conferences out, then Southern Union wouldn't be the largest anymore. They wouldn't even be the second largest. Pacific Union would be the largest in terms of tithe. All right. And I've already told you, I already gave you those statistics. Okay. 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 Here's another figure. The tithe of state conferences has multiplied 40 times since 1950. The tithe in regional conferences has multiplied almost 200 times. Okay. And this is not to denigrate state conferences at all. State conferences still form the majority of our conferences. It's simply to say that those who say, oh, you know what, regional conferences need to go away and we all need to come together. That one of the problems that we have with that is that we know that most of the people who say, let's all come together, what they really mean is they want regional conferences to merge into state conferences. Nobody is ever talking about state conferences merging into regional conferences. All right. This happens, and I really should update this. I keep forgetting to update it. The growth of regional conference has happened despite the disadvantages that regional conferences operate. Let me look at the bottom figure. Let's look at per capita tithe. Per capita tithe is another way of saying the average state conference member turns in a little under $1,000 per year in tithe. The average per capita tithe for regional conferences is about roughly 35% less than. So in state conferences, we have 35% less tithe dollars on average to operate with than the average state conference. On top of that disadvantages, regional conferences are larger, which means in terms of territory, which throws in an additional cost. When I was a president of South Central, our conference east from the furthest point northeast to the furthest point northwest was about 800 miles. Okay. So administering that much territory by itself adds an additional expense. All right. But here is, and these figures haven't changed much. I just keep forgetting to update them. But let's use figures that are now 2 years old. So in order to fund the mission of the church, the worldwide mission of the church, no conference, state conference or regional conference, keeps all its tithe. Okay. That on all of us as conferences send roughly 25% of tithe dollars on up to the higher organizational levels, the union, the division, the general conference. So let's look at Georgia Cumberland, which operates a portion of the same territory South Atlantic does. Now, it doesn't even operate through the whole territory because South Atlantic operates in North and South Carolina. The territory, the state conference that has that territory is the Carolina Conference, which does $26 million more tithe. So if you really want to look at the difference in tithe, you really would need to look at 80 million. The 54 million from Georgia Cumberland and the 26 million from Carolina. Okay, but let's leave Carolina out of it. Okay, so Carolina sends away, Georgia Cumberland sends away 25% of its tithe. That's roughly $14 million. All right. So Georgia Cumberland has $14 million more per year to operate before South Atlantic's, the treasurer, of South Atlantic is a young lady by the name of Merquita Mosley. Merquita Mosley was my treasurer when I was president, and she was a teenager when I was youth director. So fine, young, very smart young lady, does an excellent job. But before Mrs. Mosley writes her first check, she's $14 million behind.
So Elder Edmonds, one, I want to, this is great. I want to ask a question that I think is where you're leading. First of all, thank you for your diligence, your scholarship, and your ability to share this history. I want to kind of plug in a couple of holes. I'll start with where you were and let you round out this thought. But what it seems that you're suggesting here is that the regional conferences, while covering the same territory as unions, we have 9 unions, 9 regional conferences, are doing so with fewer resources. So as you were pointing out there, South Atlantic Conference covers Georgia, covers the Carolinas, but it's operating and doing the work of the Southern Union, it would seem, but with fewer resources. I feel like that's where you were leading. Kind of round that thought out for us there.
Well, Southern Union is bigger than Georgia and North Carolina.
Right. Of course.
Okay, but they operate, your point is they operate a significant part of the Southern Union. And that's true. That's true. And they do it with fewer resources. And that isn't, that's not, we're not wringing our hands. We're not complaining. We're simply saying the Lord, for the people who say regional conferences need to go away, they're missing the fact that regional conferences have been blessed by God to do more with less.
Elder, that brings us to one of the questions that we got from Mr. Willie Davis. He said, can you explain the difference between diversity and equity in the Seventh-day Adventist Church? Speak to the difference between diversity and equity. And I think part and parcel of what you were just explaining may speak to that just slightly, but unpack that for us a little bit.
And I'm not sure if I understand the question, but let me try. And
okay.
Mr. Davis or Elder Johns, you can, if I totally missed the mark.
Okay.
Equity in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and there are, and if I were to be honest, when we have our board meeting on Monday, we meet the regional conferences meet 4 times a year. The presidents, secretaries, and treasurers, we all meet. And so that meeting will be Monday. And one of the questions is going to that comes up is this push that it is not coming up from us, but it's coming from laymen saying equity would mean that regional conferences who have who operate with a third less revenue, equity would mean we would pay a third less to the higher entities. Now, none of us are pushing that because, and I'll speak for myself, I believe that we have an obligation to, one of the things that has made the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the organization. I know we kill, those of us in the church kill it all the time, but the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the organizational envy of the rest of the Christian world, because certainly no Protestant church, and I would argue even the Catholic Church, but no Protestant church has the network of schools, churches, hospitals, organizations, entities around the world that the Seventh-day Adventist Church has, and it's because we share revenue.
Elder Edmonds, that's true. I have some friends who pastor in other denominational contexts, and the other thing that makes them the envy of all of Christendom, Protestantism specifically, is while they lament oftentimes our tithing system, the security that comes along with our remuneration, the fact that I know my paycheck and my medical and my dental insurances. Some of our brethren in the other faith, in the other denominations, don't have that surety that comes from our shared resources. As we share our resources, someone in another part of a conference isn't making more because they're in a different place. It's all kind of equitable, but that is possible because of our shared resources. And that, like you said, that's one of the things that makes us the envy of other Christian, of other Protestant denominations. I want to go back to something you said earlier at the very top of your presentation, where you talked about the large demographic in the world church as well as in the North American division are those of African descent. Talking about, having this conversation to become more equitable and to see justice be done, and to eradicate systemic racism from our denomination. What do you think is going to take for us to get a Black General Conference president? Being choked up about Kamala. So just speak to that for me. I don't want to get you in trouble, but go ahead.
No, it's, the good thing, I was in an elected position for almost 30 years. I started out as the conference youth director, and I became the conference vice president. I became conference president. So for almost 30 years, I was in an elected position. This is an appointed position now. So I don't have to worry unless the people who appointed me get mad. Interestingly enough, our outreach to Africa has opened up. When we went to Kenya, and I didn't take the time to unpack that story, but my office was responsible for doing the groundwork for setting up that summit. We had like 35 people to come to Kenya for that summit. Well, you can't just have 30 people to come 7,000 miles without somebody having done the legwork. So the year before the summit, Mrs. Edmond and I went to Kenya, assisted by Delbert Baker. We wouldn't have never been able to have that, the summit without Delbert Baker. He was the president of Adventist University of Africa, which is a beautiful campus. If you've never been to Africa, I know a number of people have. One of the great myths of Africa is everybody is poor. There are too many poor people in Africa, but you got a bunch of I shouldn't say a bunch, but there are people doing very well. When I saw the Adventist University of Africa, I said to Dr. Baker, I said, I'm over here thinking of ways to raise money for you. This campus, I've been to almost every Adventist campus in the United States. I said, this campus is as beautiful as any campus that we have. I said, I'm trying to think of how we can help you. You need to be sending money back to us to help us, because this is wonderful. So that meeting opened up doors and built bridges. That was the whole purpose, building bridges. And we began to receive calls to do training and preaching. I've been to Africa 5 times as a result of those connections, and was supposed to go 2 more times this year before the pandemic hit. And so my last trip was to Johannesburg. They asked me to come and preach for their constituency meeting and for their camp meeting. And so after I finished preaching for camp meeting, one of the young Black pastors, Elder Johns, this is the point I'm trying to make, asked me the same question you did. He said, Elder Edmond, when can we have a Black president? So I said, I want to make it clear that's not the reason why I came. I said, I don't want you all to think that we have a political agenda in our outreach to you. I said, but since you asked, I said, we will have a Black president of the General Conference when you all decide we're going to have a Black president, because you are the biggest thing in the church.
Right.
And then they said, but Elder Edmond, we don't have the money. And then one of them said, but they said, but women's ordination didn't happen to a large degree because of Africa, and money didn't have anything to do with that. And one of the reasons why it was so important to build bridges is when you don't have relationships, then you allow other people to define you. And so when part of what happened in our, and it wasn't planned, we planned an agenda between myself and the assistant to the president for the East Central African Division. He and I planned an agenda, but Henry Fordham went off script. The president of
Allegheny East, yeah.
Allegheny East, and he said, "Now listen," he said, "I want to tell you. Here's what we hear you thought about us. We hear that y'all thought blah blah." And we went and told him what that wasn't on the agenda. But what happened was a candid conversation about the misperceptions that each of us had of the other.
Wow.
And that went on for several hours, to the extent that that day, the president of the West Central African Division, when he gave the closing, he had the final sermon. And when at his sermon, he said two things. He said, "I want you all to come back next year. Only this time, I want you to come to West Africa." So we weren't planning to go back for a few more years. But since he asked, we said we'll come back. So I went in January. This time last year, I was in the Ivory Coast setting up the meeting that we were supposed to have in April, but then the pandemic hit. But the second thing he said, we will never allow other people to separate us again.
Wow. I'm gonna cut in here because Willie actually unpacked his question a little bit more, and I think we were dealing with it when we were talking about what would happen for us to get, based on your statistics, a Black General Conference president. He unpacked it. He said, "I appreciate your response, Elder Edmond, but what I hear, quote, we are having X number of members, pastors, etc. But here's his question: does that mean that equity and opportunities exist within our church?" So when he's talking about diversity versus equity, he's talking about, are there opportunities? Are the opportunities equal in our church for Blacks as they are for Caucasians?
It depends on what level of the church you're talking about.
Okay.
If you're talking about the North American division, I would think that I would think that we're pretty well represented in North America in terms of North American leadership. And a lot of that had to do with the previous North American division president. Elder
Great
Jackson.
man. Elder Jackson was a great man.
Yeah. When I was in Africa, I told them, I said, just having a Black person as General Conference president isn't necessarily going to help you, because there are some people that I could name that I would put a zillion non-people of color in office before I would put them, and they're Black. I won't call their names out, but we have some people that I wouldn't want to see in any leadership position in terms of what would be good for Black people. And I told them, I said you don't have to have somebody Black. You do have to have somebody who's sensitive. Dan Jackson was sensitive, and so that's why But see, the problem is because we still have the challenges of racism. Sometimes it just depends on who's at the top. So if you get the right person at the top, you have opportunity. You get the wrong person at the top, and I'm trying to choose my words carefully, but you get a person, let me put it another way. You put a person who's less sensitive, and you have a different story. And I want to choose my words carefully. I do not think the same level of opportunity exists on the General Conference.
Right.
And when we met with the General Conference president at his request, when the regional conference presidents met with him about a year and a half ago, we told him that. I told him, I said, Mr. President, one of the problems here, because he had just made a statement at Battle Creek that caused a firestorm. Now, you probably remember it, Elder.
No, not just a statement, but the way the October dress up and all of that made a stir.
It caused a firestorm.
Absolutely.
And two of our presidents went to him and said, "Hey, Mr. President, no matter how you might have meant it one way, that's not how our constituency took it." And so his office reached out to my office and said, "Hey, here's 3 dates. Can you set up a meeting with the regional conference president?" So we went and sat with him, and we said, "Mr. President, part of the reason why you said that is because there's not enough Black people in here so that you would understand the optics of what you did and what you said." And so, but we knew what he was going to say. We knew he was going to say, "Well, the General Conference is not so North American centric as it used to be." And that's true. That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
So because we knew he was going to say that, what we did was we had somebody on the inside give us a list of all the Caucasians from North America that were there. So we said, "Mr. President, you got one." We called out the number of people who are from state conferences, and we said, "Mr. President, there's nobody here from a regional conference, not one."
Elder Edmonds, let me ask this question. It just came in. So one of our pastors, you know him well, Pastor Dr. Delroy Brooks, asked this question: in what ways is the Office of Regional Affairs advocating for change within the state-run systems and not just the regional conference work? And I think part of what you were just saying there in your conversation with the president of the General Conference about not having representation from the regional work, so that things that like dressing up in the 1800s, which signaled to people who look like me a time of slavery. How are you guys having a conversation, or is that in your purview? Is that something that you do? Again, let me restate it. In what ways is the Office of Regional Affairs advocating for change within the state-run systems and not just the regional work?
You have to be careful about how you go about that. Just like I would never come, I'm here talking to you at your invitation. I would not insert myself, at least I don't feel like it's my place, to say, "Okay, this is what you guys need to do." I am open to a conversation if the state conferences are open to a conference, and a few of them are. I did the same presentation at Kentucky, Tennessee, at their camp meeting. I did it at their largest church. I have an email right now from a pastor in the Carolina Conference who said to me, "Elder Edmond, I'd like for you to come and talk to us about how we need to change." You know, so it's a lot easier to have those conversations if the state conference brethren are open to them.
Okay. Another question. Is there an outline for dealing with social justice advocacy? This one also comes from Dr. Brooks. Is there an outline for dealing with social justice advocacy within the church?
You know, I'm trying to see how I want to make sure I understand the question so I can answer it. We have addressed it more, if I'm going to be honest, more from an ad hoc kind of position. That is, as situations arise, we address them. We address the separation of families on the border. We certainly address the George Floyd thing. We provided financial resources to both for our church in Minneapolis, the regional conferences, through our office sent funds. We did the same thing two of our presidents went to the border. And so we do things more kind of on an ad hoc basis. And part of that is regional my office facilitates, it does not dictate. So for example, I will in my meetings, and have done so, because when we meet, the agenda for our meetings comes from my office.
Mm.
And you know, I mean, I send it out and say, okay, guys, here's the agenda. Anything you want to add to it, kind of a thing. So there have been times when we've said, all right, we have issues relative to social justice that we need to address. But in terms of an outline for advocacy, the answer to that would be for better or for worse, no. Now, some of that probably is better addressed at the local church level and local conference level.
Got it. So real quick, I've heard you do this presentation. You did it for Allegheny East Conference, where I just relocated from last year. And Allegheny East is experiencing something a little bit different from some other conferences in the regional work, in that Potomac, its neighboring state conference, is being very intentional about hiring pastors of African descent. And so that's a lead into a question that just came in. Since state churches are adding, let's say, Black pastors to their churches, does that show there is no longer a need for regional conferences? The fact that state conferences on the East Coast are willing to now embrace Black pastors and have them lead Black congregations, is that an indication that we no longer need regional conferences?
No, it's not. And here's why. Remember, I said the number one reason why we need regional conferences, the last 75 years have shown that regional conferences work. Mm-hmm. If you're running two businesses and and you can only keep one business grows 16 times and the other business multiplies 4 times, nobody's going to have a conversation about you needing to close down the business that's been more successful. Right? Mm-hmm. What regional conferences have shown is the importance of being able to control your own resources and decide what's best for your mission, your missional and ministry context, and to be able to speak for yourself and to decide for yourself.
That's good.
Is something that we just can't give away.
That's good. Elder Edmonds, we want to thank you so much for your time, again, for your diligence, for the resource that you are and the wealth of knowledge that you bring to this subject. We are, and again, I have to applaud my administration because we are not in that context, but in order to, our attempt to brave this conversation and invite you in, although you're saying you were informative, not advocating, there was still inherent in your why in your choosing of your words that you still firmly believe that regional conferences are necessary. And so we want to thank you. At this time, I want to bring in my president, Dr. Sandy Roberts, and thank you so much, Elder Edmond, for your time and for your sacrifice of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elder Johns, for us. And I just want to say a huge word of gratitude to Elder Dana Edmond for spending time with us this afternoon. I will say, as a white female leader sitting here, it's heartbreaking to hear the history, isn't it? It's heartbreaking. And we recognize that we have a long ways to go, even in our conference territory, to continue to work towards our commitment to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God together as a conference territory. But this has been very educational, and Elder Edmond will continue to pray for your leadership with the regional ministries, and we may need to get you back here again to keep helping us with this conversation, because we're learning. We're on a learning curve in Southeastern California Conference, where we have, three vice presidents for ethnic ministries, but we're continuing to learn how to both work together, but also make sure that the needs of individual cultures and languages are met. And particularly, today we're talking about in our Black ministries churches. So thank you so much. I learned a lot today. and have a lot to think about and a lot to continue to discuss as we at this point hold the baton in our hands, leading the conference forward with our pastors, our educators, and our officers of the conference. So I'm going to let Elder Robert Edwards, our Vice President for Black Ministries, kind of have the last word here, as I just leave you with my commitment to continue these conversations and continue to take necessary actions towards what we need to do in our conference for greater equality and justice. And after Elder Edwards, sorry we didn't get you at the beginning with the sound problems.
Yeah.
And after he concludes, Elder Eliezer Sakai, our Vice President for Asian Pacific Ministries, is going to conclude us with prayer. And I just want to say thank you for joining us today, whether on the YouTube or Facebook. Thank you all for tuning in and learning with us today.
I want to thank you once again to our administration, Dr. Roberts, as well as to John Ciccarelli. This all began right behind the George Floyd incident and others, where we decided to be intentional about approaching this subject and finding ways that we can educate ourselves in this multicultural community. And as a result, we invited Elder Edmonds because we felt that it is best for our constituents to be informed rather than misinformed. And I just want to say, I appreciate 3 points that he brought out. The first one is that where we are, the GC had a choice. The GC made its choice and decided that the best way to go was to start regional conferences. And I'm not saying it's ultimately the best way, but when they made that choice, God enabled it to work, and it has still been working up to this day. I hope there comes a day when hearts are transformed and we all can be one. And also, I appreciate the fact that you mentioned to us, Elder, that duplication is not on our part. Duplication is amongst state conferences, in that for every one in some of the conferences, there may be 5 state conferences to one in the regional conference. So people can now understand that, no, this is not a duplicate. Duplication has taken place on the other part. And then last but not least is bridge building. This is what we're trying to do in Southeastern California Conference. Build bridges within our own context through education and forums and discussions, so that we will continue to advance the cause of God in our area, recognizing that, yes, there should be equality, but we cannot forget about equity. So it is our goal. This is not the last time that you will hear from us. There are other things that we are planning. And I want to say thank you to all of our pastors and their members who took part today, and pray that you will continue to work with us as we build these bridges.
What a wonderful presentation that we have tonight. Shall we pray? Our most gracious Heavenly Father, our hearts are touched by the heartbreaking history in our church regarding these things that have been discussed today. But Lord, you have created us all. You love us all equally, and help us that such kind of equal love be upon all of us, that we will treat each other the same. May we always grow in Christ, and may the love of Christ be emanated from our lives, that it will create a good influence of love to all. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you very much for watching, and may the Lord bless you. Good evening.